For the sake of those of you who came in after the initial introductions, I will tell you that I am Dr. George Hess from Bunker Hill, Illinois. And in these days when so many of us are doctors, one often wonders whether I'm the doctor who preaches or the doctor who practices. And I will tell you that with the Lord's help, I make an honest attempt to do a reasonable job of doing both. And if that seems confusing, why perhaps it'll be a little more clear as we go along. Oh, and on that same subject regarding things which may or may not be clear, I have not asked Mr. Dobbs or Reverend Hammond their permission, but I'm suggesting that I will, between the program sessions, try to spend some time at the booth which these two gentlemen share, and if any of you have anything that you'd like to discuss with me, preferably not in a medical way, because that's not my reason for being here, I will attempt to be at that booth to talk with you. And then I will have there, I think I brought along about 100 copies of the little tract which some of you have seen. It's been reprinted literally in the hundreds of thousands now. It's a brief 1,000-word message. You see, we have no need for churches is the title of it. And it carries a message which has been of help in a very brief form. Now, in the remaining 19 minutes, I realize that I must not follow my usual practice that I like to do back in the little town of Bunker Hill, where in that small community I can still look out the window and see the cornfields. That is, so far it's still more profitable for most of the farmers to plant corn than to leave it idle in my area. And since I have no partner, no associate, I am completely free to just take all the time I wish. And when I sit down at the consultation room desk, I can just say, well, now, Mary, you take your time and tell me about your trouble. And I like to be leisurely, both in public discussion and in private conversation. But with now 18 and a half minutes, I realize that I must dispense with that program. And if we're going to accomplish anything which will justify the expenditure of time and money getting here and the expenditure of your time and money in being here, we must move more rapidly. And so to give you a little clue as to why it is that I'm involved in both practicing and preaching, I will tell you that the Lord willing, in a little over 3 months, I will be observing a 20th anniversary of one major event and a 10th anniversary of a related and also major event, because it was on the 22nd of September in 1950 that after a long day in the office, house calls and hospital visits, at bedtime I picked up the evening paper and I read Houston, Associated Press, health plan opponents hit. Oscar Ewing, Federal Security Administrator, told the American Federation of Labor today that opponents of the government's public health program are, quotes, stupid and dangerous. Now, I had been so busily involved with building up a medical practice, paying off some debts, and spending some time in community and church activities that I was not too familiar, really, with what the government's health program was in 1950. I was, however, aware that Mr. Truman and the leaders in the Senate visualized a cradle-to-the-grave program similar to what had been in effect in England for a number of years. And what little I knew about it, I felt that it was literally bad medicine in many ways and was not for the best interest of the American people. So for that reason, I was opposed to it. But the thing which impressed me so vividly on that particular occasion, almost 20 years ago, was that this highly influential individual, appointed position in the federal government, should say that I, because I opposed, was stupid and dangerous. Because although I had not been keeping up with current events too well, I remembered quite clearly how just a few years ago Hitler had taken care of those whom he first labeled as being stupid, and if they persisted in their opposition, they were labeled as dangerous and disposed of. And I was also aware how at that very hour in 1950, Mr. Stalin was first labeling the opponents stupid, paid no attention to them, and if they persisted in their opposition, then they were labeled as dangerous, and they too were disposed of. And so I said, George, what's been going on around here? While you've been busy with personal and professional things, something has been happening in this country. And so then began a long period of self-education, reading, and assisted by some of the valiant, vocal, and effective teachers of Americanism, some of whom are engaged in this conference today. I began to learn some things, and in those first years of the 50s, I felt that we're involved with a major problem regarding political systems. And then as time went on, I became to be convinced that, well, the real basic issue is economics. The capitalist system is by far the best program for providing for the world's needs that has ever been devised, and is far superior to any socialist system, and the American people must have that explained to them, and when it is explained adequately and they come to understand it, then of course the communist menace will be faced up to, and it will no longer be a menace. And then a little at a time I began to be aware of something which was considerably deeper than the political and economic aspects of the conflict which we were even then engaged in. And I was considerably shaken up when in 1957 I read a news release that 5 major officials in the Social Security Administration were going to Russia to study the socialist system there. And then I began to get more into the communist-owned publications, their current publications, as well as some of their earlier writings, and I came to realize that communism is based on the proposition that man is born all right. What we have to do is keep him that way. When he's dead, that's the end of it. If we communists have sufficient military and political and economic control around the world so we can arrange for the lives of men from the time they're born until they die, we can ultimately bring about on this earth a heaven which is the only place that one can ever exist. And yet at the age of 12, back in Litchfield, Illinois, I was persuaded that even as a child, God was very real, heaven was very real, hell was very real, and that it was up to me to determine where I would spend eternity, because there would be one for my soul, and then when I quit breathing, that would not be the end. And so all through those years I had been committed to a fundamental Baptist church and its activity, and yet for almost 10 years I was also looking at communism as first a political system and then an economic system. As I studied in the latter part of the 50s, I found with increasing frequency the communists in their own current publications, the beautiful pictorials as well as the more scholarly dissertations, that we communists who understand the laws of social science so well will be the leaders in this business of building a scientific world in which men and women will be handled in the same way that we breed the better grades of cattle. And then it was on the first Sunday in October in 1960, a little over 10 years following my initial jolt. During our Sunday morning service, our pastor was reading from 1 Timothy in the 6th chapter. When he came to the 20th verse and read, "O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and the oppositions of science, falsely so called." It was as if the roof had fallen in on me, because I was persuaded at that moment that the science falsely so called about which Paul spoke to Timothy and through Timothy was speaking to me was not chemistry, physics, astronomy, and mathematics, because there was nothing false about those sciences, because God had established the rules whereby they operate. Undoubtedly, God was speaking to me on that Sunday morning about Satan's program of the social sciences, whereby they say we will take the child when he's born, we will direct his life, we will predict with scientific accuracy what type of individual we will ultimately produce and what type of society we will produce. And so I was persuaded at that moment that I had been called to a very specific mission field, namely pointing out to those who sit in the pews and very much concerned about preaching the gospel, yes, brother, you do have, but I must get it across to them somehow that there's an equal obligation to continue maintaining the freedom to preach that gospel. And that likewise I had an obligation insofar as the opportunity presented to get before secular groups who love their country, who love the freedom of this great America, many of them having made sacrifices beyond what I will ever make for the preservation of this great land, and somehow get to them this message that this is not just a matter of politics, this is not just a matter of economics, but it is a matter that deals with the very matter of God's existence. And as I would go before them, I would point out such things as this, for example, in Soviet Life Today, a beautiful pictorial published in Washington by the Embassy of the Soviet Union. I would say this is the sort of thing that your children are reading in the high school libraries. Under communism, religious concepts of life and nature, as well as of man and his place and role and purpose, as well as all other superstitions, will disappear. This will be replaced by a scientific and atheist view of life. There will be only one faith in communist society, faith in man, his energy, and his labor. And then in this series of questions and answers, the next question frequently asked of the communist, I'm reading, under communism, will there still be criminals? The communist answer, no, there will not. Communist society is the first in history to offer the possibility of eliminating crime completely. This is not wishful thinking, but a realistic goal. And so often there are those who will look at this proclamation of communism, that there will be a day when there will no longer be criminals, no need for a police force. They'll shrug it off with a laugh and say, well, how stupid can they get? Everyone knows we'll always need policemen. There'll always be evil people. But that, you see, strikes at the very heart of the issue. Those who are dedicated, committed, actual believing communists believe that that is ultimately, theoretically possible. Because, as I've indicated before, you see, the communist thesis is man is born all right. He's not in need of a new birth through Jesus Christ or any other way. Communism says, yes, it is, as the Scripture says, appointed unto man once to die, but when that happens, that's the end of it. Christianity says it is appointed unto man once to die, and after this, the judgment. Communism says when you quit breathing, that's the end of that individual. Christianity says, no, it isn't the end. There's a soul that goes on through all eternity. And so communism can say, yes, we visualize a day in which there will no longer be a need for a police force. But in the meantime, we have to, through various means, gain sufficient political, military, and economic control that we can implement our program of social sciences. And so as I went from place to place, when the opportunity provided, usually in churches, elaborating on this message of why the Christian should be involved and why the American patriot should know Christ. From time to time, some well-meaning individual would come up following the service and say, well, now, doctor, we realize that you've spoken from authentic sources of information, but surely you must realize that there's been a softening attitude regarding religion even in Russia since the days of Stalin. As a matter of fact, Reverend so-and-so was over at Moscow, and he visited the Moscow Baptist Church not long ago, and he found it packed. So you see, there is a change underway, and implying that somehow, really, with goodwill on the part of all, that communism and Christianity can get together. And so I said, Lord, if I'm doing what you would have me do in this realm, won't you make it possible for me, too, to go to Russia and visit the Moscow Baptist Church? Because you see, the American mind is such that if you have not been someplace, you cannot possibly understand what's going on there. Now, those same people would not expect me to have a malignancy in order to make the diagnosis or spend months in a tuberculosis sanitarium in order to diagnose tuberculosis. But, doctor, if you haven't been there, you can't know. And Reverend so-and-so, the local Methodist church, he went on a goodwill tour to the Moscow Baptist Church and came back and told us how it was packed. And so it did work out in 1962 that I visited Moscow, and then I came back as an authority. Because you see, everyone who's been someplace for the weekend, he's an expert. And although you may know all of the facts, if you haven't been there, well, you're just not in the running. And let me clarify this matter, and I, of course, am quite aware that now we have about 5 minutes left, and what can we do with it? Well, one thing that I would do with it, I would set you straight on this matter of the Moscow Baptist Church, because you see, prominent leaders in the National Council of Churches, internationally known evangelists, leaders in government, they go to the Moscow Baptist Church and come back and they say, well, you see, it is possible for communism and Christianity to work side by side because we've been to the Moscow Baptist Church and it was packed. Well, now, first of all, the Moscow Baptist Church was a forced merger at the order of Stalin back during the 40s. It is not a specific denomination in the sense that you think of it here, but a merger of all of the so-called evangelical bodies who at that time were willing to cooperate in this particular venture. And so it's sort of a combined congregation that's known officially as the All-Union Congress of Evangelical Christian Baptists. And when you hear of someone who has visited there and is coming back using that as a reason for the existence of this church, as a reason for thinking that communism and Christianity can function side by side, ask these few very simple questions. Number one, how large a city is Moscow? And they'll say 6 to 7 million, because everyone who's visited there will come back with that harangued into his mind, so automatically he'll say, oh, in the city of 6 to 7 million. How many Baptist churches, that is official churches, that are allowed to function without the risk of imprisonment? They'll say 1. And it's packed at every service, Sunday after Sunday? Yes, it's packed. And then you say, well, now listen, city of 6 to 7 million, 1 Baptist church, packed at every service. How long has this been going on? If they know their history at all, they say, 20 years or more. And then you ask this question, well, where in the world did you ever hear of a Baptist church or any other kind that was packed for a few services that did not immediately begin to plan how down the way someplace they could start another? Even under the little thatched roof in Central Africa, someone stands in the sun for a few minutes, they're beginning to think how we can start another work down the trail. Why don't they do it here? Well, of course, this person, having visited the Moscow Baptist Church, will have to say, well, Of course, the government will not allow it. Well, then if the government will not allow them to start another church, why do they allow this one to continue functioning? Because simply it serves such as an effective propaganda vehicle for hoodwinking so-called Christian people into thinking that communism and Christianity are reconcilable. This philosophy which says man is born all right and when he's dead that's the end of it, and Christianity says when man is born sinful and in need of a new birth through Jesus Christ, they say this Moscow Baptist Church is supposed to indicate we can get together. And so that's the reason they allow it to function. After several years of this and related messages, again the subject began to come up. Well, how long has it been since you visited the Moscow Baptist Church? Oh, it's back in 1962. Well, that made me an old-timer in spite of all of the hours spent in reading their current publications, Moscow News and so forth. In spite of all of the time and personal correspondence, I was outdated. And so once again, the Lord was good to me. And less than a year ago, just a year ago, the middle of this month, I was in the Moscow Baptist Church on Wednesday night. And following the service, I went down into Red Square once again and stood in front of that tomb wherein lies the embalmed body of the Messiah of Satan's religion. And then just 7 days later, I stood before that empty tomb down in the garden in Jerusalem. And it breaks my heart to realize that at this moment I could not again stand in front of that tomb where Lenin's body lies and turn around and say, folks, I want to tell you something. You're standing in front of the wrong tomb tonight. Here at midnight with an almost worshipful attitude with the beautiful floodlights on that marble mausoleum, you're in front of the wrong tomb. You're worshiping at the wrong place. Down in Jerusalem is the tomb that I want to tell you about. Oh, I wouldn't get beyond the first sentence, you see, because it is forbidden in Russia as well as most of the communist countries and ultimately all of them to say one word regarding the fact that there's going to be an accounting someday. Now, of course, communism can work with those churches which do not discuss these basic facts. I had in mind pointing out to you the very real way in which communism is happy about the way the churches across the land are fostering this matter of disrespect for the police. That's what the communists want. I have the young people's youth material used in churches across the land, pointing out to them that police brutality is a menace all across our country. Communism is happy when the Lutheran Church of America goes on record, as I read in yesterday's paper, indicating that we can set aside the laws which God has established and sexual intercourse in marriage or out of marriage is all right if you've just entered into a covenant with that individual. Oh, I tell you folks, we need to get to the point that the people in our churches give more respect and concern to the covenant which they enter into with God himself than some of these man-made things called church, which are the same old sin that's prevalent throughout the Old Testament. I would point out to you how the theologians such as Nels Ferre went to Mobile, Alabama and held a conference on contemporary Christian theology sponsored by 34 Methodist churches. And Nels Ferre is widely known for his espousal of the communist program and philosophy. There's not time for those things, so I'll simply say that we must somehow get back into our churches, convince our pastors and our people that the conflict is not politics, it is not economics, it is not military. Basically, it's a conflict over whether or not God exists or whether he doesn't. If God does not exist, we might as well go out and live it up and have fun. If he does exist, we better examine our responsibilities in the light of that fact.